This is one of those sermons where, of course, you know, yesterday when I usually sit down to tweak my sermons or finish them or whatever, I woke up to the news that John Lewis had died. And my first thought was, well, that's great. Now I have to write a different sermon. But I didn't really, and I think you'll see why. But all day long yesterday, after I finished this, I was just reflecting on how important he really was to our nation. You know, when these people are alive, we think, oh, they're brilliant, they're genius, they're wonderful and all that stuff. And suddenly when they're not there, we really see how much they meant to other people, the work they did. And I listened to all of the tributes that people were giving to him and read all the tributes. And if you have not read Barack Obama's statement on the passing of John Lewis, I encourage you to look it up on the internet, or and Joe Biden's statement about John Lewis. They were both very touching. But how many of you are science fiction fans? Or like science fiction a little bit? Okay, or fantasy, either one. I've been a fan of Ursula Le Guin for many years. She's a great science fiction and fantasy writer. And I read her novel, A Wizard of Earthsea, when I was the first time when I was in high school. And that's the first of 5 novels in what she calls the Earthsea cycle, or simply Earthsea. There's 5 novels in that series. But until recently, I was unfamiliar with a lot of her short stories until I was given a copy of a book called The Wind's 12 Quarters. And it's a collection of 17 stories that spans her long writing career. My oldest son gave me that for Father's Day. It's not a comprehensive collection because she's written a lot. She was very prolific. There are 5 other collections of her short stories. So she wrote a lot in addition to her novels. And she was also a student of religion, although she does write that she was raised as irreligious as a jackrabbit. I don't know how irreligious a jackrabbit can be, but I guess they can be pretty irreligious. And she had a particular interest, though, in Taoism. And her version of the Tao Te Ching is one of the versions that I turn to a lot. It's an excellent version. She was also a feminist and a student, as I said, of religion. She was an anti-racist. And many of the protagonists in her books, including a young man named Ged in The Wizard of Earthsea, they're people of color. But she usually doesn't let you know that until well into her stories, by the time you've made a connection with the character. And she admitted in an interview not long before her death, she said, it was, and she wrote that in 1965, I think. She said, it was incredibly subversive when I started doing it with A Wizard of Earthsea. That's very curious, the whole thing. There it was, absolutely deliberate. I was just tired of all these white heroes. Oh, this country. Racism in America. It looms larger and larger. That wasn't too long ago, a couple of years ago when she died. Which brings me to one of her short stories that I really like, and I recently read a couple of weeks ago when I first got that book. It's titled The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And the narrator in this story describes Omelas as a city that's perpetually happy. We're never told where Omelas is. In fact, it might be on another planet. We don't know. But the people who live in Omelas are always happy. Not the kind of happy that we think about as happy, but they were a very contented state of mind. Everything was very nice for them. It was very well ordered. And the narrator begins by describing one of the many festivals. This happens to be a summer festival that take place in Omelas. And there's a parade with musicians and dancers, and there's dancing, and there's food vendors, and there's games, and there's an annual horse race that young people do. It's a beautiful city. It's prosperous. It's well ordered. And it's the kind of city that many of us think, oh, it would be nice to live there. When I first read it, I was thinking of, I don't know how many of you know about Celebration Florida, which was started years ago by Disney company, the Disney Corporation down near Walt Disney World. And it was an actual city that they constructed called Celebration. You could buy homes there and everything. And there was the center of the town with the big gazebo, and it was like living in a Disneyland story, you know, a Disney World story. And I remember one time I went through it, and it was very interesting. It's not the kind of place I would live, but obviously people were very happy living there because, after all, it's Disney, right? But in Omelas, there's no central government, and there's no violence or discord. And Le Guin writes this. She says, there was no king. They did not use swords or keep slaves. They were not barbarians. I do not know the rules and laws of their society, but I suspect that they were few. As they did without monarchy and slavery, so they also got on without the stock exchange, the advertisement, the secret police, and the bomb. How can I tell you about the people of Omelas? They were not naive and happy children, though their children were in fact happy. They were mature, intelligent, passionate adults whose lives were not wretched. And so then this lengthy description of the city starts, and about its inhabitants and their habits and the lives that they live. And in it, the narrator again says, Omelas sounds in my words like a city in a fairy tale. Long ago and far away, once upon a time. But not everything in Omelas is as it seems. And there's a reason for the happiness that the people of Omelas enjoy. Everyone knows about the reason, but no one really speaks about it because it's a dark, obscene thing that can't be spoken about. You see, Omelas had a scapegoat. And before I go on about Omelas' scapegoat, it might be a good idea to look at the idea behind the scapegoat. It's the concept of the scapegoat is something that's been, we know about throughout history. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary gives this definition of scapegoat. It says, the first definition says, a goat upon whose head are symbolically placed the sins of the people, after which he is sent into the wilderness in the biblical ceremony for Yom Kippur. 2, the second definition, part A says, one that bears the blame for others. And B says, one that is the object of irrational hostility. And this appears in the Bible. It appears in the book of Leviticus when God gives the instructions to Aaron and Moses about the tabernacle in the wilderness and how they're supposed to use these goats as a scapegoat to take away the sins of the people. So it reads like this. It says, this is how Aaron is to enter the most high place. He must first bring a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He's to put on the sacred linen tunic with linen undergarments next to his body. He's to tie the linen sash around him and put on the turban. These are sacred garments, so he must bathe himself before he puts them on. From the Israelite community, he is to take 2 male goats for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. Aaron is to offer the bull for his own sin offering to make atonement for himself and his household. So he has to first sacrifice something to make sure he's pure enough to offer for everybody else. Then he's to take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He is to cast lots for the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord and the other for the scapegoat. Aaron shall bring the goat whose lot falls to the Lord and sacrifice it for a sin offering. But the goat chosen by lot as the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to be used for making atonement by sending it into the wilderness as a scapegoat. And so it goes on to explain what happens then. Aaron then offers that goat before the Lord as the scapegoat. He lays his hands on it and he confesses all the sins of Israel that have taken place the previous year. And then that goat is taken out by someone that Aaron picks, and they're taken out to the gates of the city and cast out into the wilderness so that they can just wander around and probably be killed by whatever animals are out there that eat goats. And so the scapegoat is the one that bears the blame for others. And in Christian theology, that was Jesus. Jesus became the scapegoat by taking on himself and bearing away the sins of the world when he was crucified. But other ancient cultures had scapegoats too. The ancient Syrians had a concept similar to the biblical scapegoat. It was connected with ritual purification on the occasion of a king's wedding. And so a she-goat with a bracelet hung from her neck was driven out into the wilderness, the ancient wasteland. But it wasn't just a priest who did it. The entire community did it. They all chased this she-goat out into the wilderness. But not because they were sinners. They believed that the evils that would come upon the new king or upon the city were laid on that goat. And so they chased it out. So evil was gone from the city. And in ancient Greece, they practiced ritual scapegoating as well. They did it, though, because they wanted to avoid some sort of circumstance like a famine or a drought or a plague. And in most cases, we read about it, this was an actual person of lower status who was sacrificed in that way. They were chased out of the city. Sometimes they were killed as a sacrifice. And if you've ever seen any of the stories like the Clash of Titans, sometimes in myths, it was a person of high stature who was made the scapegoat. Like in the Clash of the Titans, it's the king's daughter has to die, so, the Kraken has to get her and all that stuff, so the city will stay safe. But that's not the only place sacrifice or scapegoats are read about or heard about. Maybe some of you, I don't know, how many of you have ever read the story called The Lottery? The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. It first appeared in 1948 in New Yorker magazine. I remember reading that story when I was in 5th grade. It was in a book of American short stories that we had to read throughout the year. And I remember reading that story and I thought, what a creepy story. It really is a creepy story. It's not ancient Greece. It's not ancient Israel. It supposedly takes place in some little village somewhere here in the United States. I get the image of some New England town. I'm not going to tell you the story here if you've never read it, but read it. It's called The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. But what about Omelas? Omelas' scapegoat was never cast out of the city. In fact, Le Guin says that it lives in a room in the basement under one of the beautiful public buildings of Omelas, or perhaps in the cellar of one of its spacious private homes. She goes on to describe Omelas' scapegoat by saying that it was a boy or a girl. It wasn't a goat. It was a human child. The room she describes as damp and unused except to store a bucket and some dirty mops. And the child never leaves the room. It lives there with no one else. It's treated horrifically, only fed once a day. And only once in a while does anyone come to see the child. Usually just to look at it, or to kick it, or make fun of it, or just to stare at it. It's a horrific thing. And it's impossible to read. I'm not going to read the whole description to you of the situation of the child. It's impossible, though, to read the description of it and the way it's treated by the people of Omelas without feeling any pity for the child and of disgust and anger and rage at these allegedly happy people in the city of Omelas. You ask yourself when you're reading a story, why is this happening? Le Guin writes this. She says, they all know it's there, the people of Omelas. Some of them have come to see it. Others are merely content to know it's there. They all know that it has to be there. Some of them understand why, and some do not, but all understand that their happiness, the beauty of their city, the tenderness of their friendships, the health of their children, the wisdom of their scholars, the skill of their makers, even the abundance of their harvest and the kindly weathers of their skies depend wholly on this child's abominable misery. As I read that story, I really was filled with emotions of pity and disgust and anger. And that's the sign of a good writer, when you feel those things when you're reading them, right? What kind of people are these? I'm thinking to myself. And Le Guin had made a point of saying earlier that they weren't barbarians, but I think she was being facetious, because in actuality, they were barbarians. This was barbaric cruelty foisted on one innocent child in order to maintain the status quo, to maintain the happiness and prosperity of everyone else in the city. Amelians didn't think of themselves as barbarians because of this. They were simply doing what they believed necessary. You know, it's the same kind of thinking that Hitler and the Nazis and a lot of the German populace had during World War II about the Jews and about other minorities in Germany. I mean, after all, right, they would think to themselves, Germany is a civilized nation, a nation that had brought beauty and culture and scientific advancement to the world. What they were doing, they rationalized, was protecting Germany from being destroyed by those people, those others. And then I began thinking about America and the scapegoating of Black people and people of color that has been a part of our history since the nation was founded. First, we brought them here as slaves. They believed white people then that the majority of white people believed that Black people, it was their destiny to be slaves. They believed them to be a separate race, a subhuman race, and that was their destiny. They even justified it by using the Bible, by taking verses out of context and cherry picking sections that they believed supported those racist ideas. And there are still some white supremacists today who claim to be Christians who still do that. And then, after they were given their freedom, they weren't slaves any longer, so they had to be made into scapegoats. White people blamed the decline of white culture, and in particular Southern culture, on Black people, on those freed Black slaves. They were the cause of everything that was wrong, and they had to be dealt with. That's how Jim Crow came about. Laws that kept Black people in their place. The evils that beset America were blamed on them. They were to blame. The blame game began. Even later on, President Woodrow Wilson, a virulent anti-racist, showed at the White House, had a screening of D.W. Griffith's film. The name went right out of my head. You know the D.W. Griffith's film, I mean. Birth of a Nation. There we go. Birth of a Nation. Thank you. White people segregated them as scapegoated them as the reason for the decline of cities, even here in the North too. They were the reason that white people were out of jobs. They couldn't live among us because of the threat they posed to us. So they were forced to live in substandard housing, in ghettos, in projects. I always loved that word, projects. It sounds so, here, you're a project. We have to do something with you. How many of you have ever been into an apartment in a project complex? They're not very nice. Not very nice. I remember when I was a kid, my father had friends, a guy he worked with, who wasn't Black, who was Italian, but he lived in Staten Island in the projects. And my father would always take me to visit them. And it was a mixed neighborhood, Italians, Black people, but they lived in the projects. And I always thought, and we didn't live in a very great place, but I always thought, boy, this is horrible. How can people live here? And so they were only allowed to live among us as workers, as servants, as entertainers, you know, because they can be pretty funny, right? They can do some good acting as athletes, but don't let them stay in the same hotels as us. Don't let them drink from the same fountains as us. We were a people who needed to maintain this illusion of America, like the people of Omelas, the land of the free, white people. Remember that definition at the beginning when I told you about it. Let's read that again. Scapegoat is one that is the object of irrational hostility. And everyone here knows this. Everyone in America knows this truth. But unlike the people of Omelas, not everyone wants to admit it. We all know people who say things like, you know, they need to just let it go now. That was hundreds of years ago. All they have to do is work hard like everyone else. No such thing as white privilege. Or they may say, well, that was back then. I don't owe anybody an apology for slavery. My ancestors weren't even here at the time. And there are still a lot of people out there who are overt in their racism, right? And they believe that black people or anyone who's not white are inferior. And so America still lives with that scapegoat mentality because it's a convenient way to shift blame. It's convenient to blame someone else for the problems caused by policies and a system that benefits the wealthy but causes suffering for many others, for the majority of others. The blame game usually starts at the top, as those who benefit point to the scapegoat and tell everyone else, see those people over there? They're shiftless, they're lazy. They're destroying your property values. They're taking your jobs. You have to watch out because they're bringing drugs and crime into the neighborhood, and your children aren't safe. Your daughters and your wives aren't safe. They're in danger. Well, what happens toward the end of Le Guin's story is that some people, after actually seeing the child in the room, some people become disgusted by it. They become frightened by it. Maybe in today's language, we might say they become woke in a fashion. And some people actually just walk away from Omelas. Let me read just the final page to you. After describing a group of people who have gone to see the child and walked away in horror, she says this: at times, one of the adolescent girls or boys who goes to see the child does not go home to weep or rage, does not in fact go home at all. Sometimes a man or a woman much older falls silent for a day or two and then leaves home. These people go out into the street and walk down the street alone. They keep walking and walk straight out of the city of Omelas through the beautiful gates. They keep walking across the farmlands of Omelas. Each one goes alone, youth or girl, man or woman. Night falls. The traveler must pass down village streets, between the houses with yellow-lit windows, and on out into the darkness of the fields. Each alone, they go west or north or towards the mountains. They go on. They leave Omelas, they walk ahead into the darkness, and they do not come back. The place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than the city of happiness. I cannot describe it at all. It is possible that it does not exist. But they seem to know where they are going, the ones who walk away from Omelas. I thought about that ending to that story for a long time. And I think Le Guin is vague about it, what happens to these people, because she wants us to come to our own ideas about it. She raises unspoken questions about the ones who walk away. And as important as are her descriptions of the city and her description of the child and the horror of it all, she closes with a brief description of the people who walk away, the people who are the very title of her book. She just talks a brief paragraph about them. But it's a powerful paragraph, because after I sat with the story for a while, I began to think about those people and if what they were doing was the right thing to do. They were walking away, just leaving, trying to escape the truth that they had been confronted with, but they will never be able to forget that child or Omelas. No matter how far they walk, the child will still be in that room and will still be in their mind. They'll do all they can to forget it, I'm sure, right? To move on, but it will still be there. And that's what some people today still try to do here in America. They try to turn a blind eye, to walk away. You know, I was thinking about George Floyd. A lot of people stopped to help, to try to help. But how many people just kept walking? How many times have people just walked away when they see something happening? That's too bad. I can't do anything about it. Besides, it's not my business. Don't get involved. And perhaps for a while, people like that can be content with that kind of thinking. But the scapegoat is still there, even today. And we can't escape that, especially today. And America now has created more than one scapegoat. We find scapegoats everywhere. Black people, people of color, immigrants, the LGBT community, socialists. For a lot of people who are really part of the white supremacist movement, or maybe not even part of the white supremacist movement, but in their head, for some people it's still the Jews, or the Catholics, or liberals. At first glance, when you read that story, one can admire the ones who walk away from Omelas as people who have a conscience, who don't want to be part of that sin anymore. But after consideration, I don't think they're any better than those who stay. When confronted with such evil, rather than work to end it, they choose to allow it to continue. They choose to continue to try to ignore it by simply leaving. Again, in America, that's what's happening. Despite being shown now, especially recently, the truth of America's scapegoating, they walk away. I think about recent comments just a couple of days ago by Donald Trump about the suburbs being ruined. Ruined. Another dog whistle for his followers. Because we all know who he's talking about. We all know that he's saying that these people, these liberals, these left-wing socialists who are marching in the streets and protesting, they're out to ruin your suburbs. I was shocked when I heard him. I shouldn't have been shocked because it's Donald Trump, but I was shocked when I heard him say that. Or how Bill Barr now has men in camouflage uniforms not identifying themselves, scooping people off the streets who protest. Or maybe you heard the other day how Secretary Pompeo calls the 1619 Project, that project of the New York Times that to make us aware of the history of slavery and the Black experience in the United States. He calls that a slander on our great people. We know what he means by that. By our great people, he means our great white people. It's all out in the open now. But that's not what we're called to do, to walk away, right? As a people of faith, in our liberal religious tradition, we're called to action, to fight for change, to try to work to end oppression and the scapegoating. John Lewis often said, when you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something. You have to do something. You must find a way to get in the way and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. I want to recommend to you, before I close, Lisa and I watched it last night. You can find it on Amazon Prime or on YouTube. The new documentary about John Lewis called John Lewis, Good Trouble. It's a great documentary. If you get a chance, you should really watch it. I wish there were a way for us to have a watch party on Zoom or something, but I don't think that's possible. So think about the people who walk away this week. I know that none of you, because I know all of you, are not people to walk away. But maybe you know people who are considering walking away who say, I can't get involved. Challenge them. Talk to them about it. Say, why not? Ask them why. However we are able, we have a spiritual and a moral responsibility not to walk away. Our responsibility is to make good trouble, necessary trouble. May it be so.